Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about youth, families, and communities in educational decision making and why collaboration matters. I'm going to talk to us a little bit about what the research says. I think many folks know this already from their own experiences and practices, but I want to share a little bit about the research. I'm going to talk about the research as well on both the promise and peril of shared decision making, some of what we've learned from decades past, and also a little bit about how those the learnings from past decades have carried forward into the current moment, especially the context of decision making in California, and then talk a little bit about the research that I've done to reshape the underlying assumptions and norms and practices that exist in systems, and taking up something we call solidarity-driven co-design, and these principles that I'll talk about a little bit that shape the work that we do to reimagine how families are part of decision-making and change in education. So we have decades of research that indicate that families are crucial to educational success. And we have that from all different fields, many different perspectives, and I'm just going to share a couple of them here. We know that when parents and school staff work together, students earn higher grades, they do better on assessments and test scores, they enroll in higher level programs, we know they earn more credits, they attend school more regularly and are more motivated and engaged, they have better social skills, and they are more likely to graduate and go on to higher education. One specific study looked longitudinally in Chicago at elementary schools, and they were looking at schools that had strong parent community ties, and were comparing them with schools that didn't have such strong ties. And the schools that had those strong ties were 10 times more likely to improve in math and 4 times more likely to improve in reading than schools that were weak on that particular measure. We also have a study that came from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. This one is particularly focusing on children ages 0 to 8, but they highlighted the effectiveness of joint decision-making and other approaches to collaboration between parents and teachers in education. And they not only identified that joint decision-making as crucial, they also recognized that there are several obstacles. And obstacles included limitations to workforce and the preparation, but also a lack of attention to how families' culture and language may moderate the effectiveness of school districts' engagement plans. So we know from many different forms of research, not only that families and parents are crucial, but also that we have a lot of variability. And often school districts and systems aren't attending to families' culture and language, and in fact are treating them as sources of deficiency rather than as strengths and as resources. Another body of research has also identified those resources and strengths. Michelle Fine has done a number of studies, and this quote from one of her studies has always really stood out to me. She says, "Those who have been most systematically excluded, oppressed, or denied carry specifically revealing wisdom about the history, structure, consequences, and the fracture points in unjust social arrangements." So that brings us to this idea of shared decision-making. And it's for a lot of folks, it feels like, oh, what a great idea. We have this new idea. And what I want to share is that, often a lot of our reforms over time tend to recur. So one of the things that we found back in the 1990s was this shared participation and shared governance was a very popular form in the 90s. And Gary Anderson and a number of other scholars studied it at the time, and they found that there's some evidence that even the most democratic forms of management tend to reproduce rather than challenge the institutional status quo. And they looked at a variety of different places where they were having things like school site councils. And then they said, even when participation is carefully orchestrated, most often power and influence remain in the same hands. So this is kind of a cautionary note from the 1990s. And as many of you already know, I'm sure, we have a number of studies that have been coming out about the efforts that are unfolding in California. And one of those studies found that without careful attention to racial power and privilege, the implementation of community engagement policies may promote racism in practice. So for California, LCFF is written to be a race-neutral policy. However, our research reveals that it yielded racist effects in implementation. And this probably comes as no surprise to many organizers and many families and communities who have been participants in these efforts. So what is the problem? Why we have this, on the one hand, robust body of work that suggests that families are crucial, that they result in positive outcomes for students, and in particular for students who have been racially minoritized or otherwise oppressed by systems. The role of families can be really potent. And on the other hand, we have this body of work that's saying these structures and policies that we've created to enable families to have voice, to have say in decision-making, are often falling short, and in fact are sometimes reinforcing the dynamics of racism that already exist in our systems. So I already have the kind of headline there. Really, these structures and policies are important, they're necessary, but in and of themselves, they're insufficient because our systems have contained inequities that operate at multiple levels. So I'm just giving a few examples here. You can see at the broadest level, we have structural inequities, things like historical segregation, we have redlining, we have funding for schools that are based on things like real estate. We also have institutional practices. An example of that would be discipline practices that fuel a pipeline from school to prison, especially for Black students. An example at the individual level is that we might have interactions playing out in a classroom between teachers and students or between teachers and parents that are positioning language and cultural practices as deficiencies, are communicating exclusion or marginalization or othering young people and their families who are not part of the dominant, white dominant kind of norm. And that is reflected in this representation here of what we call the settled expectations of schooling. We have a dominant model in which schools are at the center. And I often invite people to say, what do you notice about this representation? And people will say, well, the building of the school is in the middle. There are arrows moving out from the school, and those arrows only go one way. We have these representations of these other things that might matter in schools, but they're also limited representations. They're not connected to each other, and they represent dominant institutions, but not necessarily other kinds of institutions that might matter outside of a kind of Western notion. It also kind of represents this idea about who gets to set the agenda and who gets to decide what matters and what doesn't matter. So part of what's going on in there is we have what I've come to call these racialized institutional scripts. This comes out of a set of theories that has to do with how organizations work. And those institutional scripts are a set of taken for granted norms and assumptions, and they shape our expectations about who gets to do what, who gets to decide what makes for a good teacher or a good parent or a good principal, who gets to make the final call. And unfortunately, we have these racialized scripts do vary, but the families who depart from white middle class norm are often framed as deficient, and those scripts are actually, they actually function to disengage many of the families that folks are trying to bring into partnership. A lot of those assumptions mean that the trainings tend to expect parents to become supporters of the school's agenda and their expectations. They assume that schools are neutral spaces that aren't touched by historical, racial, and power inequities, and they seek to assimilate non-dominant families and communities to white middle class norms, values, and behaviors. And this is often under the guise of very good intentions. But these models or these assumptions are very powerful, and often things that we don't think to question. But they have really profound implications for young people. John Diamond and his colleagues found that teachers who have a deficit view of Black students and families then take less responsibility for those students learning. So for example, they'll give them less of the benefit of the doubt. They'll give them less time to try to come up with answers. They'll try fewer different ways to help students understand. So I wanted to just share a little bit about the work of the Family Leadership Design Collaborative. Because there's this one context and one approach that we've identified to kind of move away from those default models. And just briefly, the Family Leadership Design Collaborative is a national network. We started with these 10 sites across the country. A second phase was really going deeper with 4 sites. And it's kind of an ongoing network. We kind of hit the pandemic, so some of the work has shifted. But I wanted to give you a kind of snapshot of what does it mean to kind of move differently? Well, how do we think about equitable collaborations that are departing from those scripts? So co-design is a process of partnering and decision making, and it's engaging diverse people to collectively dream, to identify problems or possibilities of practice, and to invent new solutions. And so it's a collective learning process that really seeks to center relationality and stories. It's about designing with, not for, young people, families, and communities. And it's really about thinking about the moment-to-moment interactions as an opportunity for intervening in systems. And I'm happy to talk about that a little bit more in the later session. We have this idea of prolepsis that we really try to enact in solidarity-driven co-design. And some of you may know Maisie Chin, who is an organizer with Cadre. And she said one of the ways that we could think about that is to naming it as creating the future in the present moment. So a key idea in co-design is that tensions are catalysts for change. And what I want to say is that leaders and policymakers, we are often seeking to avoid tension. And that's often seen as a measure of good leadership if there isn't tension. But when we're doing work that is really deeply trying to change our systems and trying to reimagine the kinds of outcomes and possibilities and futures, tensions and contradiction are inherent in that work. And so co-design really seeks to put those tensions on the table and to use them as levers to disrupt the kind of inequitable power that unfolds. So an example of a tension that I just laid out earlier is this idea of partnership with families and communities, and then families' actual lived experiences of exclusion and marginalization. So I'm going to wrap this up in just a minute here. I wanted to give you one quick snapshot of a place where this has been happening in West Salt Lake City. There, as in many other places, they have something called school community councils, and that's a budget decision-making council. And many of the Latinx families in that community experience them as very alienating contexts. They experience them as places where they were just asked to rubber stamp decisions that had already been made. And they often didn't understand what was happening in the context. Things were moving very quickly. There were Robert's Rules of Order. Everything was happening in English. So they came together with educators, with principals, with university partners, with teachers, and other supporters to say, what would it look like if we reshaped this process so that it was actually one in which we could be influential in making decisions? And so that was an example. That what they did was they went through a series of sessions of really trying to understand the experiences and possibilities in their own community and context. They worked at ways to transform the power in their school site councils and the ways that the power played out inequitably in those processes. They worked to build reciprocity and agency in their process. And overall, over time, they undertook change as collective inquiry. So these are principles that undergird a lot of the work that we've done. You can find more about them in this book called Just Schools that I've written with a number of different partners. And I wanted to leave you with just a couple of teasers of things that as we think about systems, decision making and shared decision making, that we really might think of in relation to these principles. So for example, as we think about beginning with families and communities, we have a lot of models that are about listening and about voice, and really moving towards something my colleague and collaborator Dakota Irby calls influential presence. What does it mean to ensure that young people, families, and communities, particularly from Black and Brown communities, have influential presence in our decision-making processes? As we think about transforming power, how do we shift from just thinking about structures to reshaping the everyday routines and interactions that where the work is unfolding? As we think about building reciprocity and agency, moving from things like parent trainings to how do we think about developing the capacity of systems, and especially administrators, decision makers, and policymakers to rethink their own leadership practice and to engage in a different kind of relationship with families and communities and young people themselves, so that they can begin to really share decision making and partner with those folks. Oops. And lastly, as we think about undertaking change as collective inquiry, how do we move from implementing models to co-designing solutions? Any given model that's out there, and there's some terrific models, but any of those models can default to the dominant practices and the dominant power. So how do we think about any model we're within, using those as opportunities to co-design change and solutions?